a nut is that?
Welcome back to another episode of
Just
a squirrel looking for a nut, trying to get out of this rut.
Okay, it's always those last two clauses that we stumble over, but that's part of the
process. We gotta
process.
figure it out.
We're going to have to do a dress rehearsal or seven sometimes. Anyway, before we even start, I wanted to say hello to my new friend, Claire Davis. Thank you for being here today. This is your first episode, and we hope you stick around, enjoy, and by all means, give your comment. And yes, that is a squirrel trying to get out of his rut looking for a nut. Welcome. Today's episode is exploration. There's nothing like doing some meta stuff, right, Oleg? I'm Scott Mason. This is my co-host, Oleg, and we are so excited to have you here today. Oleg, I used to, when I was a kid, as so many people have heard before, I'd run around the wheat fields of Kansas. I'd go to the creek that was in the horse pasture behind my house, and I'd find crickets and crawdads, and I'd play with them, and I'd take home baby turtles and make them my pet for the night. They'd always run home. And then at night, when I was the only little half black, half white child with black parents in my all white neighborhood who happened to be, well, I was the only person who was like me. I was like Luke Skywalker in that scene from Star Wars. I'd go out into my backyard. I'd look up at the stars, and I'd dream that there would be a world that was better for me out there. For me, it was a disco city in the heavens. And so I developed at a very young age the desire to explore, to build something new for myself, to build something better, to have a life that was worth living. And that was why I explore. But I wonder, is that why everyone explores? Why do we explore? And what does exploration mean to you?
I think for me, exploration means a couple of different things. I think it's the pursuit of wanting to find myself. I think it's the pursuit of wanting to find sense of purpose, sense of identity, sense of belonging, something that I've focused on. So I can't say that my childhood was as you described, but I will say some things that might relate to some of these concepts and examples of adventure that you were able to experience. So these past 2 weeks, I was able to binge watch, not in a whole day, but over the course of a week, The Hobbit. And then from there, I transitioned to The Lord of the Rings.
We haven't even hit the Silmarillion yet, but that's a book. So we'll give you a pass on that.
So let me just start there. Wow. What a story. And the more that I started to look at the different characters within those storylines, the one particular character that I saw myself in the most was Bilbo Baggins and Frodo. I did not see myself in Gandalf. I didn't see myself in Thorin or any of the other characters. And I think the reason why is because of this concept of exploration. Being open and willing enough to go on a quote-unquote unexpected adventure and yet have the inner belief within me that things will work out like they're supposed to. So I think there's something beautiful about that. I know for me, it's all those things that I described, the sense of purpose, belonging, identity, but there's also that fascination of the unknown, not knowing what's going to happen or what the journey is going to look like, but it's going to be one full of wonders. It's going to be one full of people and conversations that might meet along the way. So I think probably, I don't know if it was a good or bad or whatever it was thing to watch those movies, but I'm even more inspired now to go on this upcoming trip. And, I don't know if I'll live in the United States after that.
Well, I will tell you this. Hey, it's good that you did not see yourself in Gandalf. I mean, you're not even 30 yet. So if you're seeing yourself in a 900-year-old wizard with a beard down to his crotch, then there's a problem. Claire, before I go any further, we are so happy to have you here too. Second, anything that brings you or other people to the great J.R.R. Tolkien, one of, in my opinion, the most profound thinkers of the past 150 years is a good thing. And so there's nothing, in my opinion, but greatness that can come from a discussion in which J.R.R. Tolkien is referenced. Number 3, danger, fear, exploring things that you might not understand the turnout with regards to, or you might not even be able to imagine what they could mean for your life. To me, that's part of the joy of adventure. I wanted very much to know what was in that disco city that I was imagining. You know, the reason why I imagined a disco city, and I'm going to tell everyone this right now, and Oleg, you're allowed to correct me after this day. I've been advised that I'm not allowed to mention Donna Summer anymore in public. So I'm letting that obsession go. Richard Marks, it is good to see you. You're allowed to mention Donna Summer, by the way. I know who she is. Now, there was this album that she had when I was a boy called Bad Girls. And it was a gatefold album. And inside there were all these city scenes. And it was like this electric blue, everything was. And there were street lights and lampposts and police officers and prostitutes everywhere. And it looked so exotic and so funky. And everyone was so good looking and so sexy. And I thought, that's where I want to be. I want to be with the cool people. I want to be walking around some city where there's blue electric light everywhere. And the tough looking cops are standing on the corner with gorgeous looking women hanging on their arms. That's the life I wanted to experience. And I knew that even in the montage of photos in that album gatefold, there was danger. That's what made it appealing. I recently was having a conversation with a friend of mine who worked with me in government, and she said that she was talking about me to another long-term government employee. Both of them are career-long government employees who never left or would conceive of leaving government. And they were talking about me and saying they were so confounded by why I would have left. Donna Summer is dead, Richard Marks says. Yes, I'm very sadly aware of that, Richard. Don't remind me. It breaks my heart a little bit every day. Anyway, and we'll talk about her adventure and what that might mean for the sake of adventure at some point later in this conversation. But in any event, one of the things that they said is we can't imagine why Scott would leave the city. He could just be working in his office and doing all sorts of really interesting legal work and be safe and comfortable and knowing everything was going to be okay. But he won't do that. And I told her, you don't understand. I don't want that safety. I don't want that security. I want the lows. I want the highs. What I was saying is I wanted to explore and feel the adventure.
Well, I think to add on to that, it's something that actually Richard Marks had shared with me in a conversation I had with him recently. And that is, he said something along the lines of settle in, but don't settle down. And I think the reason why that spoke to me in particular is because the more that I thought about my own character and my own personality, that's the thing that actually is at the core of who I am. Is I love to be, having transitioned however many times by now, I enjoy the process of having to transition. I don't see myself being tied to any specific location or any specific setting, but more so having the freedom and flexibility to go and assimilate myself into any culture, into any environment, and find a way to communicate and find some of these things like home, belonging, identity, whatever it is. So I think the more that I think about what you just shared, that's what it made me think of, is the importance of choosing to settle in, but not settling down. That's where I think growth starts. Growth ends.
Can you ever do that without danger?
Probably not, because I think the concept of danger, I think it's always there to a degree. I mean, I associate danger with uncertainty and the unknown. And so making some of these decisions where it involves changing locations or environments or even friend groups, transitioning from one group to another, I think to a degree, it involves a form of danger, form of uncertainty, and form of unknown. But I will also say this, that in my opinion and for me, there's beauty within that. There's beauty in being the unknown. There's beauty in being in some of these newer environments because it allows me to see elements of myself that I might not have seen before when I did settle down. Because I think part of the settling down, I don't know what your experience has been like or anyone else's, Richard and whoever else that's tuning in right now, but I'd love to hear it. But when I used to settle down throughout my life, my growth stopped. I was no longer looking at that next thing. And not necessarily the next thing as a form of accomplishment, but more so, I feel like having a moving target in front of me, whatever it is, that experience that I desire, it helps me frame life. It helps me become more intentional with my actions in my life, because then everything that I'm doing is towards a specific goal, towards a specific state, towards something that I'm going for. Versus if I just settle down, that's where I think goals and everything, they don't become as relevant, or maybe not even needed.
Do you agree with Richard that we're told we have to settle down, that we're conditioned to do so?
I think so. I think it definitely is conditioned. I mean, think about, what is the American dream? The American dream is to make enough money that can get you a house, kids, golden retriever. That's the American dream. Everything that we strive for it's about accomplishing that next level of achievement, which will then measure your status within any particular class.
But then staying there. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that was embedded within, although you didn't exactly say it, about the American dream, and that's the stereotype of it, is the 2.5 bedroom house, or 2.5 kids and 3 bedroom house with a white picket fence.
Yeah. And
you say to people, when you're about to step into that version of the American dream, which was pretty much the standard version of quote unquote the American dream that's been pushed on us by the political, cultural narratives that there are out there. It's, you've sowed your wild oats, or you've dated, or you found your spouse, and now you're going to settle down and live the American dream. I never heard someone say in my life, you're going to settle up into the American dream. I've never heard someone say, by the way, that the American dream will be a stepping stone onto the next level. It's always a twofold conception. Settling down as an overarching matter, which it is interesting that includes the word down as opposed to up, but then also settle, that's where you'll stay. Because the message, as I'm hearing that as you say it, and as I think about it, has to be, once you achieve this certain level of comfort, that's where you, in achieving the dream, should be content to hold yourself.
Yeah.
And the more I think about that, my own disposition, the boy looking at the stars and dreaming about the disco city, that wasn't him. Was it ever you?
In some aspects, I think to some degree. I was actually just having a conversation with Jürgen on his podcast around this, and he had asked me the question.
Jürgen Strauss?
Yeah.
Well, can we just briefly give a shout out to anyone who listens to this or may hear it? The InnovaBuzz, INNOVABUZZ podcast. I'm so thrilled to know that you've been a guest on it. Oleg, I've been a guest on it. Jürgen is Australian. It's a tremendous show. I'm sorry to interrupt, but he deserves a shout out. He's amazing.
He does. He's a really fascinating person. But the one question he asked me was, how did I view the future when I was younger in my quote unquote survival days, and how do I view the future now? And the way that I answered it was that when I was younger, my concept of a future, it was about getting to the next day. Now it's much broader when it comes to it. And I think the reason why is because the people that I oftentimes think of, or I used to think of as far as future aspirations, were all attainable. They were either my next door neighbors, people living in across the road, or people that you oftentimes see on the news. Living in Russia, that wasn't the case. It was very different. And so even from the cultural perspective, this whole concept of a dream and the aspirations and the things to strive and shoot for, they're different depending on how they're presented to you. So
how are they presented in Russia?
I think it's more along the lines of stay within your own lane. I think the concept of wanting to kind of shoot for the stars, land on the moon. I don't think that's really a thing.
Is there class mobility in Russia?
I think it's still partially like communist. So it's more, I think, along the lines of stay in your own lane, but don't try to be better than the person next to you. Mm-hmm. You know, it's almost like trying to create a equal playing ground, which maybe to some degrees it works, but at the same time it adds a lot of complexities, because to what degree can you even dream beyond what you're told and what you're given? See, one of the beauties of, I think, of the United States is due to the level of freedom. And what I mean by freedom is freedom of thought. It allows the opportunity and the ability to dream your wildest dreams, to do the things that you once upon a time thought were impossible, but yet having the ability to become a version of Michael Jordan, become the president, or whatever those aspirations may be. Those things are, I think, ingrained within this culture. Now it's a double-edged sword. I think it's a danger and a blessing.
Yeah. Oleg, Richard, anyone else who is listening, watching, wants to comment, I ask the following. Mm-hmm. If you could go on an adventure and Bryce Guillory, wow. Bryce Guillory, I have not seen you in probably, I won't even say how many years because we're both only 25, but it's been a long time, and this has been a true wonderful surprise. Thank you for not only popping in, but taking the time to give an insightful comment. You are welcome to come here and join in the conversation anytime. I'm ecstatic to see you. Getting back to the question.
Yeah.
You, Bryce, Richard, anyone else, if you had the chance to go on the adventure of your lifetime and shoot for the stars, and achieve so much that you achieved wealth, fame, impact, glory beyond your wildest imagination, but it would only be short-lived. And then eventually you would crash down to the bottom, maybe end up like Napoleon, banished to some island or thrown into prison for the rest of your life. So you would have the highest of heights, but you'd also have the lowest of lows. You would have experienced both the true upside of an exploratory spirit, but the ultimate downside too. If you were given the choice, the opportunity to live that life, would you do it?
It's a really good question. You know, if I had the chance to go to the Lonely Mountain, I'm kidding. Now, I think yes and no. I would do it as long as it had the right things that I was going after for. Particularly speaking, I'm not that interested in accumulating as much wealth. I do believe that forms of wealth, so money in particular, I do believe it's a resource, and I believe it's a necessary resource in order to be able to function in today's society. But for me, it's not the ultimate thing that drives me. So, you know, would I do it? I would say yes, if it had the right things that I'm looking for, like as far as meeting interesting people, having all the conversations that I could. But I will also say that maybe to your example, to a degree, I don't know if that's necessarily a kind of like an aspirational trip. I think that's probably every trip that I've taken to date. I would go somewhere new. I would get to experience the culture, the people, and everything that it has to offer. And then I come back home, and you spoke about that fall. That's the fall that I experienced.
Coming back home is a fall. Like it's time for you to move. It's time for you to buy a new house.
No, but I think the reason why that fall happens is because I come back to places that I already know.
Well, this is a different way of looking at it, though. And I do want to also say hello to Duncan Leaf. Welcome to the show. It is good to have you. And we're going to address that question in a minute. So hold tight. Let's say, and I'm going to wrap Duncan's question into this. When you went on that trip, you were caught up in some sort of revolution in that other country. Mm-hmm. And you ended up the ruler of that country. But then eventually, karma or fate or political winds changed.
Yeah.
And you ended up caught and arrested and put into prison for the rest of your life because of that. Would that trip have been worth it?
Probably not. I think primarily because it's a slightly different ending to that experience than the one I anticipate. I truly, as open as I am to all experiences, going to prison is not one of those areas. And it has nothing to do with the people in it. I'm sure that there are people. I'm sure that.
Well, it might.
I'm sure,
depending on who they are.
I'm sure that there are some people who are great within all of that, and
Yeah.
I'm not here to judge, or are there for wrong circumstances.
Yeah.
But it's not an ideal setting for me because it doesn't really. I don't picture it as an ideal setting for me to flourish and to thrive into person that I am. But
Yeah.
I will also say, to touch upon Duncan's point, because it brought up a thought within me and my own experience. And his question was, is longevity more important than experience? So I would say, I don't know if I would even necessarily say yes or no. I think for me, experience is more important than longevity. And what I mean by that is having the ability to experience and understand the different things that I'm able to gain through it. That to me is probably one of the ultimate forms of life and what it means to be alive. The longevity part, I think can't even say it would be great to live for however long or forever, because if your purpose is to achieve X, Y, and Z, well, how do you put an age limit on that? And then I guess the other question is, would you want to live forever? I know I wouldn't.
Well, actually, Bryce made a point that relates to Duncan's, which is in answering the question about this extreme adventure arc that we talked about earlier. It depends on the point in the curve you're at, right? He says, I'm 2 decades away from living in this truck. He is not talking or revealing which decades he's talking about, and I won't ask because I'm not going to ask and try and get someone to say something they don't want to say.
Yeah.
I'll just say that that's actually a really, really good point. How long are you going to be in prison for after you've had that revolution? Are you 94 years old and you only have a couple of years left, so what the hell? Mm-hmm. Or maybe you are only 50 or only 30 and you've got good 20, 30, 40, 50 years in that jail that you can be reflecting back on your time as the ruler of that country. And did he save, and Bryce also asked, did I save my family in the process? Well, that actually goes as to then the things that you leave behind that people don't always talk as much about when you go on an adventure, and or the opportunities that the adventure presents for those that might be associated with you. And it reminds us that we're not living in utter isolation. So actually, those are really helpful points. When you go on adventures, for instance, when I left for the Disco City in the Sky, I left behind things in Kansas. They're just things that I cannot imagine caring about. But that doesn't mean that they might not have been things that were worthwhile, or that might not have meant that my own imagination doesn't have limitations that would have precluded me from being able to see amazing things that, despite all of the phenomenal experiences I've had in New York City and other places around the world that I've been, they might not have matched what I could have experienced had I stayed in Kansas. And so maybe settling down really isn't, because we're talking about the opportunities of going on an adventure and the excitement and the ups and the downs and the risks and the danger and growth. But what about the opportunities that you miss when you do stay in place?
I think you can look at pros and cons of both. For me, oftentimes when I go on an adventure, especially what it involves going into a different city, like this time around, I'm planning to go to different countries. Going to a different city, it's one thing because I have the ability and it's relatively easy to turn around and go back. Going to a different country, it's a slightly different story. There's more of a time frame that's involved within that. So I know one of the things that I take into consideration when I travel is I understand that the people who have been in my life and the important relationships that I have developed within my life, I'm taking them with me no matter where I go. Now, there is a process where I do miss the in-person interaction that I have with them that I no longer experience if I'm in a different environment or a different place. But at the same time, one of the other things that I'm trying to learn, even as we speak right now, is that some of those interactions, maybe they were meant to evolve. Maybe it's actually a healthier version for me to not be so dependent on seeing the person in person so often, but finding other ways to communicate with them and develop parts of our relationship that we may not have had a chance to work on.
So you're about to go on this exciting multi-country, long journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to have ups and downs and all sorts of things that I'm only imagining. Mm-hmm. And my own imagination in this case, I know really is limited, and I'm so happy and excited for you about that. But if you were married, would you go on that trip?
It's hard to say. I don't know if I have an exact answer to that, but I will say that for me, it's important to continue to evolve. Personal growth is one of the pillars for who I am. So if I were to put it in a situation where I would look at my marriage as something that is there hindering or stopping my growth, then that's where I think I would have to make the decision of, how important is that? So I think it probably goes back to Bryce's point as well, his comment regarding family. And that's understanding what is really important and what do you truly value when it comes to that. When it comes to you taking a trip, what are the things that you value? So if it's for me going to different countries and not being able to see my family as often in person during that time, it doesn't mean that I value them any less. What it means to me is that I still value their presence and I still value the connection that I have with them. But I also value the importance of continuing to explore and continuing to grow and continuing to develop. And I think that's where settling down, in my opinion, it stops some of those things. It stops, for me, in my own experience, there were times where it stopped the growth. It stopped the curiosity. It stopped the exploration because I was in a place of security.
In the middle and late 2000s, my husband and I, in one case, him without me, and in one case with me, spent some time in India. And not in the northern areas of India where a lot of Westerners go. We spent the overwhelming, in both cases, amount of time in southern India where there are very, very, very few Westerners. And the first time he went by himself. By the third week, he called me up. There was an immense amount of pollution in the air, and his voice was really struggling. And so he was on the phone in this place, I don't know where it was. It was some traffic-ridden place that he couldn't stay on the phone forever, calling me. He was saying, "I miss you so much. I can't wait to come home. I miss you. I miss you. I miss you." And I missed him so badly too. When we went together, I loved it. And I think we both could have stayed there forever. Then a few years later, I left government work. I did not have another job when I left it, and I wanted to spend that time exploring my life and opportunities for myself. And I considered going to India, applying for a job there, and just living there for a while. David, my husband, would have stayed here in New York City, and he was comfortable with that. He wanted me to be able to explore, to have that time. He would have missed me. I think I would have missed him too. Ultimately, that didn't happen, but I was thinking about that time that he called me and was saying, "I miss you so much." And I was wondering if I would be calling him and saying, "I miss you so much." And there I would have been really unable to come home, absent quitting a job that I would have, presumably not been in that long. And then that really got me thinking, well, what is the value that matters the most? Is it that companionship? Am I willing to sacrifice growth because I miss being with someone that I love that much? The beautiful thing was David was fine. His concern was that I go and that I grow. And he knew that he would be there for me and that our relationship would survive. It was me that was worried about whether the growth process that would entail would destroy the thing that I view as most precious in my life, which is the relationship.
What do you miss about people when you're in situations like that?
I miss that connection. I miss the history. I miss being able to talk to them at will. I miss being able to feel their energy. I went to, in 2019, I think I've told you about this before offline, to a Toastmasters convention in Denver, and my husband couldn't make it. He and I, though, had an earlier vacation together, and he just came back to New York and I went to Denver. And it was a lovely convention center. It was so beautiful. But I remember when I checked in and I started to walk to my hotel room, I was alone, and I said to myself, I could die of loneliness if something were to ever happen to David, because I was struggling with loneliness without him even being there, just in that plane ride over to Denver, and then the taxi ride to the hotel, and then the checkout into my room. Now, obviously, I made it through the event and I found all sorts of new friends and kept myself occupied, but I was intensely glad to see David again. I was just so glad. It was overwhelming. And so I suspect, again, I pride myself personally on being highly adaptable, and that relates to my sense of adventurousness. So over time, I would adventure and learn how to deal with not having the relationship around. But that would be, for me, I suspect, an extraordinarily difficult process. And that's, by the way, a growth step I don't know that I would want to take, which goes as to another question I have for you, which is, we're talking about wanting to grow, exploration, adventure, does that sort of thing, but is growing always better? And Bryce, if you could explain when you said that actually happened to me, just remind us about what, so we don't incorporate the wrong sentiment into the conversation.
I think growth is a double-edged sword. I think it comes in phases for me. There are times throughout my life where I get lost in reading books and just being a sponge for information, new perspectives, new ways of thinking. But I will say that there are also times where I'm absolutely exhausted from that growth. And I think part of it is because it kind of a two-step process. Like, it's one step for me to take in all the information, but sometimes what I forget to remind myself is that it's great to be able to put myself in all these opportunities where there's all this new information available. But in order to process it, that requires reflection. That oftentimes, for me, it requires that form of isolation that you spoke of, where it is just myself and no one else. Because the more perspectives I hear based on that, the more complicated it becomes for me to process what it is that I'm actually understanding. I mean, think about it this way. The best example that I could think of revolves around this concept of purpose, right? Purpose is something that I think, in my opinion, many people strive for and seek in this life. And what I realized was that on my own journey of discovering my own purpose, there became a point where I was receiving so many different perspectives from people about what my life should look like, what I need to be doing, what I need to involve myself in, where I was just overwhelmed with it all. And then that overwhelming feeling turned into frustration, because now I have to juggle 10 different perspectives of what my purpose should look like in life. And now I don't know what to do. So then that leads to confusion. The confusion about what I thought my purpose was, but then here are 10 other perspectives that are different from mine. So which one do you pick? So I think, to a degree, the growth, yes, it's good and it's healthy. It's given me opportunities to get to the next layer, so to speak. But at the same time, I also value the time by myself, the time where I am in complete isolation, because that's the time that gives me a chance to reflect and really understand for myself, what is it that I'm seeking and what is the grain of truth within each and every single one of those perspectives surrounding that particular topic.
Duncan makes a remark from a completely different discipline that is extremely relevant. Duncan is a jiu-jitsu teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of every class, he gives what's called a mat chat, which is a little lecture. And it usually is a self-improvement, personal development sort of lecture that ties into the theme of jiu-jitsu as a metaphor for the human experience.
Yeah.
And in jiu-jitsu, God knows I've experienced it. You learn a little bit, or maybe you learn a lot. You grow as a martial artist. But then there are periods of plateau. And the plateau periods, as I've experienced them, sometimes demonstrate just a lack of additional growth. You know you're not getting any better. You're not doing any, your technique isn't improving, your speed isn't improving, you're not learning new techniques any faster or slower. You're just sort of stuck. Sometimes for me, plateau has been experienced as a downward slope. I hit a peak, I learned it, I'm moving faster, I'm absorbing new information more quickly, I am more inspiring to be a jiu-jitsu partner with, and I'm more inspired by jiu-jitsu. But then in those sorts of plateaus, I get worse. I forget techniques. I forget things that I've just learned. I forget basics. But in any event, once those plateaus, whether they're flat or in my experience, they tended to be backsliding. Okay. Once those things were over, I tended to then shoot up again. And it's almost like the plateau in the jiu-jitsu context was your mind and your body's way of saying, enough. I've learned what I can learn. I've absorbed what I can absorb. I've done what I can do. Give me a break. Yeah. And the Lord said, let's rest on the seventh day. and then you're able to, after that period of plateau and regeneration, become stronger. The frustrating the thing about plateaus, and I'm sure Duncan has spoken about this during his mat chats and would have a lot to say about this as well as anyone who is an experienced martial artist, is that the plateau's time frame is never on your own. It never comes when you want it to. In fact, it usually is after periods of intense growth. So you're feeling great about all this growth and improvement that you have, and then bam, you slap down a little bit. Irritating. Then it lasts as long as it wants to. So you're saying to yourself, when will this doggone plateau end? Yeah. I'm ready to start learning again and getting better. And it doesn't happen. And then it just happens when somewhere in a place way back here in your mind, or somewhere deep in your muscles, or somewhere in your nervous system, or whatever is regulating your body's movement, it says, okay, I'm ready to come out of this coma. And then you start to get better again. Is that relatable to you in terms of what you were talking earlier about learning and being around people?
I think to a degree. And actually, another thing that I wanted to ask you as you were sharing that, do you think it's possible to get past the plateau point on your own? Like, are there ways that you can stimulate growth again?
I was talking about that because in terms of my own business development and some projects that I'm working on that Oleg, you and I have discussed between the two of us privately, and I'll be discussing, publicly more openly in the future. There was a period earlier this year, looking back on it, where I was feeling a sense of plateau, or it's feeling almost like tailspin. This isn't moving forward the way I was anticipating it to, not at the speed I want it to. I felt some mental setbacks. I felt some emotional setbacks. I wasn't sure whether this was right for me. And then I recently began working with some people that specialize in helping people in my situation. And I am beginning to feel better about it. And so the plateau is something that I'm coming out of. So working with someone who has an established process that is aligned with how I operate, at least, is perhaps one way to trigger out of a plateau. Another friend of mine said, a quick, easy solution, Scott, would be for you to take some mushrooms. And that, what do I know? That may or may not work. But I'm not going to be taking them right now and telling you all about it. Okay, I'll tell you that. That I know will not work. And then sometimes I think that it is just, it might be biological or neurological processes. Sometimes it might be what Duncan says, a time frame to have some introspection. And then sometimes I think it's providence telling you it's not time yet.
Mm-hmm.
The time will come.
Mm-hmm.
And I will awake that within you.
Yeah.
When it's ready.
I've experienced similar things. I think one of the most recent ones that I've experienced is in regard to the podcast that I've been doing for a couple of years by now. And what I've personally experienced was that there were so many conversations that I feel like I've had conversations on. And yes, there are other angles that I could see the courage, the confidence, and all these other topics through. But I in a way, hit a plateau for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think the travel and the desire to have conversations with people who may not even speak my language evolved, because that is one additional new level of growth that I get to engage in and learn more of. So that's where I was curious as far as, is it possible to respark or ignite that growth when the plateau point hits? And I think for me, the answer is probably yes. But I will also say that there are times where I try to ignite the growth in the middle of kind of the flat plateau point, and it didn't work. It didn't work. I kept going back to just slowing down, reflecting, or not doing anything. I don't know if that's something that you do within your own week. I think you do on Saturdays, you mentioned.
Yeah.
But for me, I started to do a similar thing on Thursdays, as well as either Saturday or Sunday. And that's try not to do anything that is quote unquote work related, just to give my mind a break. And whether that means literally whatever it means, walking outside or going on hikes or doing some of these things that put me in a different state of mind. The other thing that I'll mention that I'm going to implement in my life, where I started to slowly. So I had a conversation with a friend of mine today. His name is Xander Phelps. He was a guest on our podcast, and he had mentioned this concept of juggling. And he was saying how juggling, because of the intensity that it involves of going from one side of the brain to the other, is actually a great activity to do, because it allows you to be, it requires you to be fully in the moment, in the now, so to speak. And the more that he chose to share that story, the more that I started to realize that for me, much of my life, due to the concept of exploration and the desire of wanting to explore, I think I live a good portion of it in the future. I can't say that I live that much of it in the now. I think I use the past to be able to learn the different things that I had to kind of course correct moving forward. And then from there, everything is built on the future. And maybe part of that is the culture. Maybe part of that is the culture that I live in when it comes to being in America. And that's always focusing on the next goal, the next step. And long story longer, it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge to be in the now without having so much of the focus be in the future, because so much of my environment is about focusing on the future.
Mm-hmm. Bryce shared an interesting story that circles back to our earlier conversation about the opportunity costs associated with going on an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very much appreciated, Bryce, because, and it also relates to what you were talking about just a second ago, Oleg. We can focus on the past that may or may not provide us with an incentive or a motive to go on the adventure. But in any event, once we're considering whether we want to go on an adventure, or once we're on the adventure,
Mm-hmm.
it can be something that can be a tether, or something that we leave behind, or something that we try and find a middle place for, which is kind of what it seems to me is related to what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We can also focus on what we will miss in whatever we leave behind, like
Mm-hmm.
the things I missed by leaving Kansas behind.
Mm-hmm.
But what he also talks about there is not just what you experience on the adventure itself, but the unexpected side effects of that adventure that you might never imagine.
Yeah.
A similar experience I had once with my husband was, and it's much less dramatic and much less worthy of an extreme level of celebration as that which Bryce described. My husband and I went on a trip to Norway. We went on these boats that were going up and down in the fjords, and there was a stop that you could get off at for your hotel, and there were not roads between these cities. You just were on the fjord boat or not. And we missed our stop. And we went to the captain of the boat, and he's like, well, we're not turning back for you. And there's no way to get back, and we can't drive you back because there are no roads. And by the time we get to the next city, it's going to be after dark, and so the boats don't go anyway. So I guess it sucks to be you. And so we went to this city, Bergen. It's a small, adorable hamlet in Norway. And with the assistance of the crew of this ship, we called up every hotel in the town. It was so hot. They had a heat wave in Norway that they were utterly unprepared to deal with. Every hotel room was booked except one that was on the first floor and had no windows. And so it was deathly hot. They had no air conditioning, and there were no windows in this hotel room.
I hope that will not be my experience.
Well, I hope so too. It was awful. Then the next morning we got up, and in European hotels, they tend to give you free breakfast. I don't know why they don't do that in the United States, but they do that in Europe as a matter of course. And we went out on the terrace overlooking the harbor. And the breakfast that we had at that awful hotel after that awful night was the best breakfast we have ever had in our lives. And we still remember it to this day. It may be still to this day, many years later, the best breakfast we've ever had. And it's a little bit like what Bryce was talking about, an unimagined, totally unexpected benefit of the adventure. It wasn't even about our growth. It was about experiencing something that was beautiful. Duncan asked earlier, is it better to have longevity or experience?
Mm-hmm.
If you have longevity with no experience, if you're sitting in a jail cell, I would argue it's probably a lot worse to have longevity. If you are having experiences, even little ones like that bring you joy, I would want the longevity. The question I have is whether you could even have longevity without experience, even if you're sitting in a jail cell, rotting away.
And I also think that goes back to another point within all of that is the concept of meaning. Like you mentioned, you could sit here all day and you can not create all of these additional experiences. But I think what makes an experience unique, in my opinion, is the fact that I have a choice in what meaning I choose to associate with that particular experience. You could have gone to that hotel and you could have not even had a single second thought about it. And then you chose to look at it through a different lens about that whole experience and not have the actual sleeping arrangement be the thing that you remembered. Mm-hmm. But it's more so the breakfast, the things that amplified that whole experience that you were able to be a part of. But that's where it makes me think of this concept of choice and how powerful choice is when it comes to going through certain experiences. Because, I mean, you and I can experience the same exact thing. You and I can experience a flat tire, okay? And you have the option to, let's say, look at that through the lens of, I can't believe this happened to me. How could this ever happen to me? I'm late for all these other things. My day is ruined, blah, blah, blah. I could look at it through the lens of, I'm grateful that this has happened to me because it gave me a chance to slow down and enjoy the patience, enjoy the introspection, maybe as Duncan had mentioned. So I think there's that choice in choosing, in looking at each one of the experiences and then understanding what is the meaning that you choose to associate with that thing. And in a case where you don't choose to associate, then experiences are just experiences. Event is just an event. Thousands of those happen over the course of the day. But why is it that you choose to give meaning to one of those and not some of the others?
I was having a conversation yesterday with someone who was in a very bad emotional state due to some very tragic things that happened to her recently. And as she was talking to me, she was going through the list of terrible things that had happened in her life. And I will not lie. They were all awful. And one thing that she kept saying over and over was, I feel like I don't have a choice. I feel like I don't have choices in my life. And that broke my heart, because I felt that with her not believing she had agency, she was trapped in a cycle of despair. And I don't want despair for anyone, especially anyone that I care about, but anyone, even if it's a stranger I've never known. Despair is, to me, the worst. And I wanted to say to her, and I tried to ask her questions that could lead to this conclusion, that she has a choice. She just may not like the outcome of the choice. The choice may be radical, or the choice may be painful to make. But I don't believe that this friend of mine was prepared to hear it. Also, the things that she was describing led me to believe, or to at least question, what are the limits at which choice really exists? And is it perhaps my own hubris that would even think someone who had had these sort of situations occur to them can have a choice?
That's a really good question. I think it's a matter of perspective. I think it's a matter of perspective of understanding that there is a choice. I think choice comes from an understanding and more maybe of a belief in you thinking that the choice is possible. I personally believe that there's always a choice. And the reason why I believe that is because I have not come across a particular instance within my life where I did not feel like there was a choice. Now, whether that choice is going to help me in X, Y, and Z way, or possibly take me a few steps backwards, there's no way of knowing that. I don't think there's any way of predicting the consequences of any particular decision. But just a reminder, and I think it comes from perspective and maybe a level of enthusiasm as well, and being optimistic. Optimism, I think, plays a big role for me in understanding that that choice is always available to me.
Duncan asks a profound question, but one that's very relevant.
Yeah.
Are you a determinist?
What is a determinist?
So, Duncan, you have a philosophy background. I urge you to type in as your understanding of this, because I'm sure it's more detailed than mine. I actually am somewhat of a determinist. I actually am. But basically, it's, as I understand it, putting it in the most lay terms, that the agency and freedom of will that we have is extraordinarily limited, and that we are primarily governed by events that have preordained the choices that we have and the outcomes that are possibilities for us. And the reason why I am somewhat of a determinist, is that really, when you think about it, we are, when it comes to choice, limited by things that are predetermined, one of which is evolution. For instance, I cannot choose to fly away from danger because I don't have wings. And why do I not have wings? Because evolution has made a determination that I do not have it. Oh, Duncan says I got it right. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you, Duncan. Whew, I was getting nervous there for a minute. And so I cannot make a choice about whether I want to fly or not, because the choice has been made for me by virtue of the fact that I don't have wings. The power of determinism, by the way, from a self-improvement perspective, is that it allows us the freedom, if we think about it carefully, to break free from guilt. And it allows us to have an extreme level of gratitude. If you believe that every action and choice that you've made is determined by the circumstances that you've been put in, as well as the evolutionary and other factors in your life, when you make bad decisions or do things that hurt people, you have nothing to be guilty for. Not only that, but when you remove the concept of free will from an analysis of your behavior, you have a lot to be grateful for too, because you're receiving the benefit of things that your own free will and decisions had no role in. So the only conceivable response to them is gratitude.
So if that is true, then what is free will in that particular case? Is it just simply the ability to make the decision that's available to you?
Again, Duncan, I'm sure will correct me, but a hardcore determinist would actually say there is none. We have invented that concept in order to stay sane, but it really doesn't exist. We can't face the truth, a determinist would say. Basically, cause and effect, Bryce says, right? It removes it, right? We are simply all acting on causes. We are simply the effect of causes that we have no control over.
It's a harder one for me to grasp because, well, many reasons, but I think one of those is because I do believe that I have some free will when it comes to making choices. Well, I think there are deeper topic here, but there are. So I see how consequences, or not consequences, but certain events may put me in a position where I don't have the ability to make certain choices, such as the one that you described. There's a fire, I don't have the ability to fly. My abilities are to run, to crawl, and whatever else I might be able to do, right? The thing about, I think, the free will that I question more of is just understanding that I still have the ability to choose. And yes, even though I do believe in the cause and effect, but I don't believe it's necessarily I'm one and then the other thing is the other. I think that I do, to a degree, have the ability to manifest some of these things that I aspire for. Now, I do believe that there's some form of higher energy, frequency, whichever way you want to categorize that is working in harmony with my life, and that's probably helping me along the path discover X, Y, and Z. But I think if anything, what it does is I don't think it necessarily determines the path or makes the choices for you. I think it, if anything, in my opinion, it presents opportunities for you to pick. So it will present you with an event to which I get to choose and exercise my own power of choice of whether or not I see that as an opportunity, as a door to walk through, or something to just keep passing by for the next event. Does that make sense? That's where I think that concept of free will for me plays a role. That's how I understand it. That's how I understand life. That's how I understand the whole concept of having things that are predetermined, and also understanding that.
If you were told you could never go on an adventure again, that you had to just settle down and live in that white house with a picket fence and a wife and 2.5 children and a dog that wasn't a fun one like Caleb, and you had to drive a station wagon or a Suburban, and you were going to be living in an office doing spreadsheet-oriented job for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And you could never be on a podcast again. And the furthest you would travel would be to the grocery store, and you damn well better get white bread. Would you want to live?
It's a really good question. So would I want to live? I think I would have to look at it through the lens of what does it mean for me to be alive, and what is the greater purpose that I'm striving for in the life that I have. Now, I know that for some, that greater purpose is to truly build a family. They have put themselves out of that equation of pursuing their own interests, their own things that they want. So it's all about serving those that are part of their immediate tribe. So maybe I would say maybe it's a yes and a no. For me, personally speaking, because growth and learning and this mindset of exploration is at the core of who I am, it would be very difficult for me to find the reasons to live because everything is so quote unquote determined. There's no room to grow. There's no room to explore additional curiosity. But if my purpose was to solely serve my family and those that are in the immediate circle, then yeah, I would be able to find reasons to live. So I think if anything, the way that I would answer that question is it more so goes to the purpose. How do you define purpose in those circumstances? Your purpose could solely be to serve your family. Or your purpose could be to become who you are or be who you are and explore and continue to grow. And that would be a harder reason.
What would you say to those who argue that the purpose of the human race is to or of any individual is to propagate the species?
I would probably say that that's just one opinion.
And why would you say that would you have an opinion as to whether it was a justifiable one or not? Yeah, you weren't going to slip out of that one that easily. But that was a very noble try, my friend.
No, I think there are many ways to live life. I don't think there is any necessarily any one way of doing it. I'm more so choosing to believe in the concept that everyone is right according to the lens that they see it. So whatever it is that the purpose that you choose to subscribe to and believe in when it comes to your own life or what the direction of humanity looks like, that's your purpose based on the lens and the perspective that you're seeing it right now. So for me, I look at it through the lens of who am I to come into your life and to judge and to say that whatever it is that you believe in is wrong. Even in some of the more extreme cases, when not even outside of the human species, but even as it regards to animals, I mean, taking the life, like I may not agree with it and I don't agree with actions like that. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know, people have their own ways. And if there's anything else that I've learned along this process is that I can't change other people.
Do you think human beings would have been driven to explore the planet if we did not have the drive to reproduce?
That is a good question.
And I guess I'm wondering because I'm curious to the extent to which, leaving aside individuals, we as a species have the drive to explore as a result of our drive to reproduce.
And is that a drive to conquer as well, would you say?
I would say no.
Why is it that we desire to reproduce?
I would say it's likely evolution, that a species that does not have a drive to reproduce is less likely to do so than one that does. And so a species that does not have the drive, even if it can reproduce, it just doesn't give a darn, it is more likely to become extinct. And so merely going back to the theme of determinism that Duncan raised earlier, as a matter of deterministic outcomes, the drive to reproduce will be programmed into any species that manages to make it in existence for anything other than an evolutionary hot second.
And I would say that it has been programmed into probably every single one of us. That's what I would argue. I mean, for me, I know that this has been something that I've had questions around as far as when am I going to start a family, and when I'm going to have kids, the house, the golden retriever, and all these other things that illustrate the whole concept of American dream, but also just progress in society. I think much of progress is measured based on the ability to reproduce and to grow.
What do you think of people who don't have children?
What do I think of people like myself?
Well, no, let's say you're above, let's talk about people above the age of really, normal reproductive parameters.
I think it's their life to live. I think I more so just try and understand it from the perspective. So for me, having children, in my opinion, it's not the most important thing in my life. I think there are other things that I choose to put value on, such as my own personal growth, understanding of life's purpose, finding a sense of belonging, finding a sense of identity. I think having children, it's an interesting topic, I guess, to begin with. I really try. I don't judge people that whether they chose it or whether they couldn't, because that's the other part of the story, is that there are some people that have tried and they just couldn't have children. Now, I might be one of those people. I have no way of knowing until I quote unquote try. So, I guess I look at it as, I don't look at that as the ultimate thing to life. I don't look at the reproduction part as my ultimate goal on this planet. I think for me, the ultimate goal is to just be able to be the best version that I can, and then from there impact whoever it is that I can along this journey in whatever way that I can, even if that means impacting myself ultimately. Because I think I don't know what your experience has been, Scott, and I would be curious to hear it, as well as Duncan and anyone else that's listening right now. But for the longest time, I used to subscribe to this concept of wanting to change one person at a time, one day at a time. And although I think there is truth in that statement, but I think what that statement implies is wanting to change someone else, not necessarily wanting to change yourself. And what my time and experience has proved to me is that, in my opinion, it's very difficult to change other people. And if there's anything I can't control, it's the change that I go through personally. So that's my long-winded answer of what do I think of people who don't have children.
Bryce is asking, when did this turn into a night in Watson Lounge? Watson is a dorm in college. Every Thursday at 7:15, Bryce, is a night in Watson Lounge. Just because you're grown up now doesn't mean you can't have fun with the boys here. So come back and have a conversation with us over and over again. And yes, we're not afraid to. We don't smoke on this show, but we're not afraid to have the sort of conversations that we might have if those of us who were less than innocent were smoking. Never me. So,
of course.
Yeah. So I never inhaled. Never. So, yeah, he does ask a little interaction, the will to interact versus a will to subjugate. So that's an interesting point. I was assuming that the will to or the drive to explore was driven by the desire to propagate the species, because it would the propagation of the species would require more resources, which would then favor a species that had an exploratory component to its makeup, because it will have access to more resources if it explores. Now, Bryce's, I'm going to take off on Bryce's point a little bit here. The drive to explore can be what I view as pretty innocuous, which is what you're talking about, the idea of getting to know people better and getting to have experiences and share perspectives and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be. The drive to explore has been historically very much, yes, resource acquisition was a part of it, but some of it was just the desire to subjugate, for power and control.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think there's probably a healthy balance within that when it comes to that desire to explore and having the drive to explore. For me, if anything, it's to expand my current perspectives and understanding. But there's also a question within that. Who's to say that the perspectives that you have right now are not enough?
Well, and what are the consequences of the discussion about perspectives?
Yeah.
There is an incredible sci-fi book by the name of The Sparrow. And it was written, a few decades ago, but it holds the test of time. And in this story, and there's a little bit of a long thing. I'm going to try and keep it as succinct as possible, but it's relevant. Mm-hmm. Humans detect music coming from a planet. And so it's clearly artificially generated music, like ours. So they send the UN and public authorities try and get themselves together and fund it, but it takes forever. So the Catholic Church just puts its own exploratory mission together and sends it to that planet with the idea of finding out whether they are Catholic or not, and if they're not, to convert them. And the team that goes there, who are Catholic scientists mostly, meet on this planet. Well, the first thing they do is they set up gardens so they can eat, because they obviously are not going to be able to eat completely alien plants or their equivalent. So they set up this garden and they grow these plants and start to eat them. Then they encounter two species. One is a higher intellect humanoid species, and another is a lower intellect humanoid species that's really not very creative or imaginative. And it turns out, as you read the novel, that the lower intellect species is being kept as slave labor for their own native farming, as well as to be eaten ultimately by the higher intellect humanoids. But the lower intellect humanoids are still humanoids. They're capable of feeling, thinking, doing work. They're at the intellectual level of, let's say, a child, a human child. Mm-hmm. And that being said, the lower level humanoid people or humanoids are not so stupid that they can't learn from others. Mm-hmm. And what they learn from the humans as they exchange perspectives, because the humans come in contact with the lower level humans first. What they learn from the earth-based humans is how to plant and farm their own things. They don't have to follow the instructions of this higher intellect. And so they're able to learn how to plant their own gardens, tend their own fields, cook their own food, and suddenly they're not dependent on the largesse of the higher intellect species. Mm-hmm. And it leads to a revolution that breaks that planet. And the surviving higher intellect people capture the earth-based humans and throw them in jail. They flay their arms as punishment for this. Mm-hmm. And it's a really interesting case of where what seemed like an innocent exchange of information actually completely disrupted the balance of a whole planet. And as an aside, that music that the church thought was so beautiful that they were sending out was their version of pornography. And so even exploration as an opportunity to exchange experiences, I view this as a metaphor about, could have consequences that are beyond our imagination. Now, in some case, those might be what Bryce talked about earlier, which is the birthing of amazing children, that his life is going to be richer because of, and that the world would be much more poor than if they didn't exist. Well, what about if these exchanges lead to disastrous consequences, society crumbling consequences?
And to what degree can you tell the difference between which of the perspectives or information that you choose to believe and pass on?
And who were we, by the way? Because the initial reaction of Earthlings, when they heard that this arrangement was being shattered, this sort of mutually dependent, kind of slave-like, not quite slave-like, but kind of like indentured servitude-like relationship existed. Of course, they opposed it, and based on Earth's history and us as humans, we should. But who were we to say? Who are we to impose our culture, our values on an entirely, not just an alien Earth culture, a culture on a whole other planet?
Yeah. And that, I think, directly ties to Duncan's point and question, and that's who are we as individuals place our own perspectives and values onto someone else's life and tell them that this is the way that life needs to be lived. And that, I think, that is more tied to the ego of wanting to have ownership and wanting to know that the experience that I'm going through is, quote unquote, the right one and one that's followed. And maybe part of that is due to the influence of how society has evolved over the years. I mean, even having the whole concept of a president. I get it that there's value in having a role like that. But at the same time, what year are we in? 2021. There's so many aspects of that role that, in my opinion, need to be redefined.
It's a tough question, and it's a more difficult one than would seem on the surface, because part of what we like to do on this show, I've observed, and that our guests challenge us, or that our guests and our participants challenge us on, if we let them, or if we're careless, which we need to be challenged on, is holding contradictory thoughts in our minds. On the one hand, what this points us to, and for those of you who have watched the show before, Oleg and I are the one thing that we've come to, I believe, an agreement on, is that sometimes we don't need to offer an opinion about anything. Sometimes we just need to shut up and listen, because the world doesn't always need to hear what we have to say. And that is exactly what Duncan is talking about, ego control. My ego self-discipline has got me to understand that I might think I'm right about anything. No one cares. It's got me something to say about shit. But other times, though, if we don't offer our opinion, injustice can go unchecked.
Correct.
And how do we, right? Like the whole abolition movement, slavery. As a gay guy, if people were silent about their opinion about gay people, for all I know, I could have been lynched as a little boy.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, what do we, where do we draw that line, and how do we draw that line? It's a very loaded, challenging question.
It is. It's a challenging question. And I don't have a line, so to speak. I don't have an answer to it. I think if anything, for me, it's more of a feeling. And there's certain things that I don't choose to go into when it comes to pointing out these quote unquote changes that I aspire for in other people's lives, because that's their journey. But maybe there are certain elements that I choose to share my perspective in order to influence a different thought. For example, like when it comes to murdering someone else, that's a topic that I'll share my perspective in order to influence a different way of thinking. Now, when it comes to something else that's not as extreme, so to speak, some other experience that might be more of like a personal challenge, personal issue that the person's going through, then instead of wanting to change it, I don't know. So here, this is a perfect example where I choose not to offer an opinion because I totally don't. I don't know. I don't know what that line is, and I don't know if there is no line, and if it's more so just me overstepping every single time. I don't know. You know?
So Duncan asked one last question, and because our time is nearing an end, I'll actually use that as a gateway to the final discussion.
Yeah.
How can we have convictions at all if we allow for relativism, which is exactly what we've done? We've just said people have the right to their own opinions, and sometimes we don't need to have an opinion about it. That's just our ego. Well, then how can we have any convictions at all? Why are we all not just Charlie Brown flakes? Wishy-washy wimps.
That's a hard one. That is a hard one because I mean it has happened many times within the past however many months. Even the whole concept of the Earth is flat and the Earth is round. If everyone is right,
yeah.
If I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but
yeah, because we've agreed. Sometimes I don't need to state my opinion.
But theoretically, if everyone is right, how do you choose? Right? How do you develop a foundation? How do you develop a foundation of what is the common belief?
Right. I mean, and Bryce asks a great question. What are your opinions on human dignity? Right. Because that goes as to exactly what Duncan said. If every opinion is relative, every perspective has meaning. Is there any meaning when I say, because this is something, Bryce, I believe in the strongest terms possible, I will not back down from, which is that every human being does have dignity. Every last one, especially, and you can even hear me going off here, especially those that society or those that are the most vocal in society believe don't have a right to dignity. Those are the ones that I think have the most, who have the right to dignity, whose rights need to be stood up for more than anything. But if everything is relative, exactly what you just said, Oleg, who am I to argue with someone who would say, Scott, you're a gay guy, you're likely not going to have children, so you have no right to human dignity. Now, I often do not have dignity simply because I'm not always a dignified person, although I try to be. But is there a certain level of dignity to which I'm entitled even when I don't deserve it? And if so, how can anyone hold that conviction?
Well, I will also expand upon that, and I think maybe one of the ways to find that as far as the convictions go is trying to understand it through the lens of what is it that we all believe in?
Maybe nothing.
Maybe nothing. Or do we all believe in the concept that murder is wrong? Do we all believe in the concept?
People don't believe that, or our jails wouldn't be full of murderers.
Exactly. So that's where I think that question of what is it that we believe in that a human being is, and what is it that we're doing in order to create that reality. I mean, the more that we even have this conversation, the more I'm walking away with a lot more questions than answers, and I'm actually curious to hear from you and Bryce and Duncan and that anyone else that's tuning in.
Richard and Claire, anyone else, absolutely.
And that is that question of what is it that we believe in as far as the universal truth amongst all of us.
That's what this show is about. And those of you who were in the audience who brought these questions and who told these stories and who offered your opinions that made it tough, that's what we want from you. We believe in this space as a place for the deep conversations, for Watson Hall, never ending, Bryce, or whatever your college dorm room was. But there are also other places where we can have those discussions. Oleg, why don't you talk about the two forums that you have?
The two forums that I have where discussions like this take place, one is called Overcoming Odds, and the other one is called The Power of Your Story. I was going to steal the name of your podcast. The Power of Your Story. Both are focused on creating a space for people to share their stories and ultimately learn from their stories and their experiences. And that, I know that's something that I've strongly believe in when it comes to gaining insights about one's purpose in life and meaning, and extracting different takeaways that I might be able to take away from each and every single one of the experiences. I'm a huge believer that every experience has the window of opportunity to extract a lesson from it. So I believe that there is a lesson behind every single experience, but that's due to choice, something that we spoke about, the power of choice and being able to associate meanings with each one. And I know that you focus on similar work within your own line of work, podcast of your own, Purpose Highway, correct?
Yep. And for those of you who have not heard about it yet, Oleg has been kind enough to scroll the URL down. Purpose Highway is a space for stories about people who are connecting to a higher purpose to build a better self and a better world. Mm-hmm. It comes out every week, and we've had some amazing guests really grounding the concept of building a better self, a better world to purpose, their journey there every week, so that folks can be inspired to think, feel, listen, learn, and connect to their own space. Mm-hmm. Oleg, also maybe you can talk briefly about the special event that we have coming up.
Absolutely. So there's the event that we'll be hosting. Scott and I will be the first two to host this on the March 21st, which is a Sunday, called Survive to Thrive, Attitude of Gratitude. And the reason why we wanted to create this space is, so this is through another organization that Scott and I are both a part of called Overcoming Odds. And the whole thing revolves around this concept of gratitude and what gratitude means as far as a mindset, what it means to develop greater resilience through gratitude, and then grieve through gratitude. I know for me, I'm looking forward to it for a couple reasons. A, I always look forward to these experiences because these are opportunities for me to grow. These are opportunities for me to further explore, to further develop. And I know that you probably take a similar approach to events like this.
Yep. I've learned and grown from the perspectives that have been shared during these events. And I think that everyone who has been to them also has learned and grown. Finally, I'm going to ask that anyone who's listened to, watched, whether live or on replay down the road, this show and enjoyed it, to be sure to leave us a review on Facebook and to subscribe. We really believe that now, more than ever, those Watson Hall conversations need to be happening. We've spent too much as a culture and as individuals forgetting the big questions, pursuing the small. We're here to go back to the big, and we want you on that journey. Oleg, I hope I haven't taken words out of your mouth, or I hope that isn't a thing where you've simply said, I have no opinion. I don't want to say anything more. I'll talk to you about that later, Scott. But that's how I feel about it. This is an amazing journey that Oleg and I are going on together, and we want you all with us.
Mm-hmm. And I do believe in this space. I believe in the power of having an open space where you can share perspectives without the feeling of being judged, but ultimately to be accepted. I know that that's something that I've been striving for many, many years in my life. And I'm just grateful that you and I are able to come together and create the space not only for ourselves, but for everyone else that chooses to tune in.
Excellent. Everyone, thank you. We shall see you next week.